Stevie Wonder was Motown's biggest earner. He had recorded hit after hit since he was 11 years old. On his 21st birthday, he refused to give them any of it. He locked every new recording he had made in a vault and told Berry Gordy he would not release a single note until they gave him control of his own music. Gloria Patterson was 28 years old in the spring of 1971 and had been working in the administrative offices of Motown Records in Detroit for 4 years. Her job lived at the intersection of paperwork and music, the contracts, the licensing documentation, the royalty processing, the administrative infrastructure that allowed a record label to function as a business. She was precise, and she was fast, and she had developed, over 4 years of working in proximity to the machinery of Motown, a detailed understanding of how that machinery operated, who deferred to whom, which decisions were made above which level, and what it looked like when something significant was being held in place. She had processed Stevie Wonder's paperwork before, not his creative decisions. Those lived in conversations between artists and executives she was adjacent to, but not inside. But the administrative layer beneath those conversations, the documentation that reflected what had been agreed, the structures that governed what a Motown artist could and could not do, that layer she knew intimately. And she had understood, for some time before May of 1971, that the structure governing Stevie Wonder's relationship with the label had not been built with someone like Stevie Wonder in mind. Steveland Hardaway Morris was born on May 13, 1950, 6 weeks premature, in Saginaw, Michigan. The premature birth required incubator care, and the concentration of oxygen in the incubator was too high. The excess oxygen damaged the developing blood vessels of his retinas and left him permanently blind before he was 2 months old. He would grow up with no memory of sight, no frame of reference for the world as a visual experience. The world, for Stevie Wonder, was entirely sound and touch. He moved through it by listening. He grew up in Detroit, raised by his mother, Lula Mae Hardaway, largely without the presence of his father, in the circumstances that a woman raising 4 children alone in Detroit in the 1950s faced, which were not circumstances that made anything easy. He sang from the time he could form sounds. He played drums on pots and pans before he had access to instruments. By 8 years old, he was playing harmonica, piano, and bongo drums with the fluency of someone for whom music was not a skill being acquired, but a language he had been born knowing and was simply learning to speak with more precision as he grew. Neighbors heard him. Teachers heard him. The people who heard him used words they did not typically use about children. Ronnie White of the Miracles heard him through a mutual acquaintance and arranged an audition at Motown when Stevie was 11 years old. Berry Gordy listened and signed him immediately to a contract that was standard for Motown in 1961, which is to say, the label owned the master recordings, the label owned the publishing rights to his songs, the label made all creative decisions regarding what was recorded and released and how it was presented, and the artist received a royalty that was better than nothing, but was not designed to make the artist wealthy relative to what the recordings generated. This was the structure Motown offered everyone. It was the structure that had built the label from a $200,000 loan into the most successful black-owned business in American history. It was not a structure built with the assumption that the person signing it at 11 years old would still be commercially relevant at 20, let alone artistically transformative. Little Stevie Wonder released his first records in 1962. Fingertips, Part 2, reached #1 on both the pop and R&B charts in the summer of 1963. He was 12 years old and had just become the youngest artist in history to reach the top of the Billboard Hot 100. He kept recording. He kept releasing. Through the rest of the decade, he produced a consistent series of hits. Uptight, For Once in My Life, My Chérie Amour, Signed, Sealed, Delivered, I'm Yours. Records that sold across racial lines, that moved up both charts, that established him as one of the most reliable and beloved artists in the Motown catalog. He was not in creative control of any of them. He was not consulted on arrangements, on album sequencing, on the selection of singles, on the album artwork. He received what the machine determined and recorded what the machine requested. This had been the structure since he was 11 years old. He had not chosen it at 11 because he had not been old enough to choose. By the time he was 19 and 20, he was hearing a widening gap between what the machine was asking him to make and what he understood himself to be capable of making. He was writing constantly, songs that exceeded in scope and ambition what Motown's production style could accommodate. He was absorbing music the label was not producing and had no infrastructure to produce. The psychedelic soul of Sly Stone, the experimentalism of musicians he had encountered at events while touring, the synthesizer work that was beginning to change what electronic instruments could do in a recording studio. He had ideas that required creative control to execute. The structure of his contract did not permit creative control. The structure of his contract had been set for a child. His contract expired on his 21st birthday. He had known it was coming. He had been deciding what to do with it coming for longer than anyone at Motown was aware. On May 13, 1971, Stevie Wonder did not sign the renewal that was waiting for him. He presented Motown with conditions. He wanted creative control over his recordings, the right to decide what he made, how he made it, and who he made it with, without requiring label approval at each step. He wanted ownership of his publishing, the rights to his own songs, which he had been writing for nearly a decade and had signed away in a contract he could not have fully understood at 11 years old. He wanted control over his own presentation, the artwork, the sequencing, the way his music was packaged and described to the world. He wanted to be treated in the legal structure that governed his professional life as what he actually was, the primary creative intelligence behind his own work. Motown had never given any artist these terms, not because artists had not wanted them, but because the label's model was built on the premise that Motown knew best, that the quality control process, the house musicians, the carefully calibrated Motown sound was the product, and any individual artist's unmediated judgment was a variable the label preferred not to introduce. Berry Gordy had built Hitsville on the idea that he could hear what the market wanted and deliver it consistently, and consistency required control. Giving Stevie Wonder what he was asking for meant accepting that the next 5 years of Stevie Wonder's career would be determined by Stevie Wonder. Gordy's position was not arbitrary. He had watched other artists make creative decisions that had cost the label money. He had watched what happened to careers that moved too far from the commercial center. He had also, by May of 1971, been watching what was happening in music around him, the expansion of what albums could be, the audiences that were assembling around artists who were doing something more complicated than the Motown formula allowed. And he was not entirely certain that his instinct about what the market wanted was as reliable in 1971 as it had been in 1961. Stevie Wonder did not wait for certainty. He had new recordings, an entire body of work made with synthesizers and unconventional production approaches, music that was further ahead of what Motown was releasing than anyone at the label had yet understood. He put the recordings in a vault. He told the label he would wait. He was 21 years old, and he had time. and the music was ready, and the only question was whether Motown would agree before he decided to take the music somewhere else. Gloria was in the anteroom adjacent to the conference room when the meeting that followed took place. She was not inside. She heard the tone of the conversation through the wall without being able to hear its content. What she processed in the administrative department in the weeks and months that followed was the specific stillness of documentation that had not moved, the renewal that was not filed, the contracts that sat in their folder without advancing. She had processed enough Motown paperwork to understand what stillness meant. It meant something was being decided. The standoff lasted 13 months. During those months, Motown continued to release material from Wonder's existing catalog, recordings they controlled, earlier work. Wonder continued to make music, recording constantly, developing the synthesizer techniques he had been studying, building the vocabulary of what he intended to make when the terms were finally right. He was not idle. He was preparing. Motown eventually agreed. The new contract, signed in April of 1972, after negotiations that had required the label to accept that the alternative to agreement was losing not just what Stevie Wonder had made, but what he would make for the next 40 years, gave him the creative control he had asked for. Gloria processed the paperwork when it was finally filed. She handled it with the same precision she brought to everything that crossed her desk. She did not read it in full detail. It was above the level of her position to parse the creative provisions. She understood from the shape of the documentation that what had been agreed to was structurally different from anything she had processed in 4 years at Motown. Something in the structure had changed for one person because that person had decided it needed to change and had been willing to wait while the institution decided whether to agree. Music of My Mind was released in March of 1972. Talking Book followed in November of the same year. Innervisions in August of 1973. Fulfillingness First Finale in July of 1974. Songs in the Key of Life in September of 1976. 5 albums in 4 years. 3 of them won Grammy Awards for Album of the Year. The run is described by musicologists and critics and musicians who study these things as one of the greatest sustained creative periods in the history of popular music, an output that influenced virtually every genre that came after it, that changed what albums were expected to do, that expanded the vocabulary of what soul and R&B and popular music could contain. None of it would have existed in the form it exists if the terms had not changed on a May afternoon in 1971. Gloria left Motown in 1976 when the label relocated its operations from Detroit to Los Angeles. She stayed in Detroit. She spent 30 more years in administrative work in industries that were not the music business, precise, reliable, doing the work that keeps institutions functioning without being the institution itself. She listened to every one of Stevie Wonder's albums when they were released. She was not surprised by any of them. She had been in the anteroom. She had heard the tone through the wall. She had processed the paperwork when the standoff ended. She told the story sometimes. She told it to her granddaughter, who asked her once what the most important thing she had seen in her time at Motown was. Gloria thought about it carefully. She said, "The most important thing I saw was a 21-year-old who understood that the structure he had been given was built for someone else, and who decided he was not going to accept a structure built for someone else just because it was the only one being offered." She said, "He waited 13 months. He made the music anyway, the entire time. And when they finally agreed, the music was ready." Stevie Wonder is the only artist in Grammy history to win Album of the Year 3 consecutive times. 5 albums, 4 years. One 21-year-old who put his entire catalog in a vault and waited. The music was ready the whole time.
Subscribe to Untold Soul Legends. Every week, we find the moments behind the music that changed everything. The comment section is open. Tell us which soul legend story you want to hear next. If this one stayed with you, share it with someone who needed to hear it today.